Hello, and welcome to this installment of Heart.Soul.Mind, the regular Bible class of St. Paul Lutheran Church. I'm Peter Pettit, the teaching pastor at St. Paul, and a word of welcome to those who have been with us throughout this 2019-2020 year as we have been studying the prophets. A word of welcome to those who may be joining us for the first or second time. We near the end of our study of the prophets, just a few more sessions left. And indeed, today we move into a new era. We have been focused recently on Jeremiah and Ezekiel, the great prophets of the exile from Jerusalem. And we turn now into that exilic period to three reasonably short prophetic books. The shortest in the Old Testament, the Jewish Bible, the book of Obadiah, and then the paired books of Haggai and the first part of Zechariah, chapters 1 through 8. As we have been doing for the past several weeks, I would invite you to turn to the handout and we'll join in a word of prayer together. That handout, along with a PDF of the PowerPoint slides that I'll be using today, should be available at a link where you found the video itself. So if you would turn to the handout or follow the prayer on the screen, I would invite you to join me in a word of prayer. Gracious Lord, you have committed your word to the prophets and your people for every time and season of life. Confirm in us the knowledge of your grace, that we may ever hear in your word how much you desire good and blessing for us. Renew in us commitment to serve you in every way that makes your presence known in the world, that all people receive from the abundance of your love. For the sake of our risen Lord, we pray. Amen. As we turn in this session to Obadiah and Haggai and Zechariah, we're looking at prophecy in biblical Israel, both in old forms and in some new forms. Obadiah turns out to be a small paradigm of classical Hebrew prophecy, and how convenient that this shortest of all biblical books in the Old Testament, just 21 verses, contains such a rich set of examples of what classical prophecy includes and is all about. And then as we turn to Haggai and Zechariah 1 through 8, we'll find more than a few surprises. What I've suggested in the title for this session, we might consider mutations of classical prophecy after studying the model of it in Obadiah. So let's turn to Obadiah first. It is the shortest book, 21 verses. It presents itself as a vision, an oracle, a prophecy against Edom. Edom was that nation to the south of Judah that was understood to be the descendants of Esau. And Esau was the brother of Jacob, or Israel, the ancestor from which the nation of Israel, and certainly the people of Judah in these days, took their name and their identity. Because of the events that Obadiah mentions and points to, we can date the prophecy certainly after the fall of Jerusalem in 586 BCE. You can see that in verses 10 to 12, where the fall of Jerusalem is referred to. But also we would assume before 553 BCE, when Edom itself fell to a neighboring power. So this is the time and the place of Obadiah's prophecy. We would guess that he may well have been in Jerusalem even after the city fell. We really don't know the location of the prophet, but we know that he is addressing Edom. And we know that he is drawing on themes that have become familiar to us in the study of the prophets. And what are some of those? Well, he builds on older traditions, clearly building on the Jacob-Esau tradition, that rivalry of brothers that we see in Genesis in chapters 25 through 37. He makes it clear that all nations are accountable to God, and with Edom as the paradigmatic nation. So this is, in a sense, the whole book is an oracle against the nations, as we have seen in Jeremiah and Ezekiel, in Amos, in half a dozen of the other prophets. He picks up on the cup of God's wrath being poured out, those who must drink the cup of God's anger because of disobedience and faithlessness. He shows how punishment fits the crime. As you have done, Edom, so it will be done to you. A familiar theme and refrain that we've seen in other prophets. He references the day of the Lord that is coming. That is when Edom will drink of the Lord's cup of wrath. That day that is coming, which we have also seen in other prophets. At the end, he affirms clearly God's kingship, which is one of the central themes of Israel's prophets throughout their history, and also the priority of Zion, going back to the great Isaiah of Jerusalem and others who understand that Jerusalem, Zion, is the place of God's particular favor, also the place of God's preferred residence. So these are some of the themes that Obadiah draws forward, in which he echoes the classical themes of biblical prophecy. And then there are the forms as well. So the book opens saying this is the vision of Obadiah, going back again to the great Isaiah of Jerusalem. The vision of Isaiah the son of Amoz is how that book opens, and other visions that we have seen throughout the prophets. But then there's the oracle, thus says the Lord, comes almost immediately within the vision. So there is the oracle where the Lord speaks through the prophet directly to the nation. And what gets spoken? Very familiar forms. Accusation against Edom, judgment of Edom, warning toward Edom, and also promise finally to Judah and God's people. And then there's style. And this is where I'd really like to spend a little bit of time looking in more detail at Obadiah, because there are a number of stylistic things that we've seen as we've studied the prophets. We haven't taken a lot of time to sit and study them carefully, but Obadiah gives us the chance to do that. So turning to verses 3 and 4 of Obadiah, notice we don't say chapter 1, since there is no chapter 2. It's just Obadiah, verses 3 and 4. Your proud heart has deceived you, you that live in the clefts of the rock, whose dwelling is in the heights. Though you soar aloft like the eagle, though your nest is set among the heights, from there I will bring you down. Here, Edom is likened in a metaphor to an eagle, a bird of prey that dwells in the heights, that soars in the heavens, that is seemingly above everything in the world. And yet, all of that height that the eagle enjoys is not enough to escape God's reach. This is metaphor. Edom as an eagle, Edom as one who lives in the heights, in the clefts of the rock. If we go on to verses 5 and 6, again, if thieves came to you, would they not steal only what they wanted? If grape gatherers came to you, would they not leave gleanings? And again, the idea of those who are attacking, not as a military force, which they actually are, but rather using the metaphor of thieves and of grape gatherers to say, isn't there a limit to what the person who comes after you is going to take? And yet, how Esau has been pillaged. The threat, the judgment against Esau that says, More than thieves would steal what they wanted. More than grape gatherers would take enough and leave the gleanings for the poor. Edom will be pillaged to the very last extent. Again, the metaphor. And thirdly, if we look at verses 16 and 18, other metaphors. For as you have drunk on my holy mountain, all the nations around you shall drink. So Edom has availed itself of every fine thing, metaphorically, a rich cup of wine on God's holy mountain of Zion. And now Edom itself will be swallowed up, drunk from the cup of God's wrath by all the nations around Edom. Metaphor again of drinking as or swallowing up as the act of attack and destruction. And then in verse 18, as the tables turn on Edom and as Judah is restored, again the metaphor, the house of Jacob shall be a fire, the house of Joseph a flame, and the house of Edom stubble. And we know what happens when fire and flame come up upon stubble. It gets consumed. The fire and the flame always win. So this is not unfamiliar now to us who have been studying the prophets for a while. This use of metaphor where the character of the nation or the character of God or the character of the prophet or the activity that's being described are portrayed metaphorically in order to help convey some of the dimensions of what's going on and to make it more familiar. As we move on, looking at style characteristics of the book of Obadiah and of prophecy in general, another key one is parallelism. You've undoubtedly noticed this previously. For example, when we think back to Amos in the opening chapters, for 3 transgressions of this nation and for 4, God says, for 3 transgressions and for 4, for 3 transgressions and for 4. It's not necessarily that there are 7 transgressions. It's not that the prophet is uncertain whether it's 3 or 4. But 3 and 4 stand in parallel lines as an expression of a multitude of sins that have taken place. And we see it in many other ways. We see it in Obadiah again, if we go back to verses 3 and 4, a very rich pair of verses for what we're looking at today. We read in these two verses, we've read it already. Your proud heart has deceived you, you that live in the clefts of the rock, whose dwelling is in the heights. You say in your heart, who will bring me down to the ground? Though you soar aloft like the eagle, though your nest is set among the heights, from there I will bring you down. There's a kind of balance, a kind of rhythm, almost a kind of poetry to this language that might strike you as particularly prophetic or particularly biblical. It's not accidental. It's because the prophets, like the psalmists and others, other writers in classical Hebrew, often use this style of parallelism in order to convey their ideas. And we can see it working out fairly elegantly here. So we see in the first line, your proud heart has deceived you. And then halfway through, you say in your heart. So both halves of this start out with a reference to the heart. And the heart speaking. It has deceived you, and you say in your heart. You that live in the clefts of the rock, whose dwelling is in the heights. This is the character who's being described. You who live in the clefts of the rock, whose dwelling is in the heights. That's saying the same thing in 2 different ways. You think that you are above everything. And then in the second half, similarly, the people being addressed are addressed Though you soar aloft like eagles, though your nest is set among the heights. Again, the core idea expressed in these two similar, parallel, but not exactly the same phrases is that you think that you're in the heights. You have it all. You're vaunted above everything. You soar above it all. It's almost as though the prophet or the poet wants us to see a reality from multiple angles. So there's this thing that is being described. In this case, an eagle in a nest high in the rocks who can soar above the world. And rather than simply saying that, whole phrases are used to give us the different angles on that that are components of understanding it. So one who lives there lives in the clefts of the rock, seemingly protected from wind and storm. Their dwelling is in the heights where no predators from down below the mountaintop can get at them. They soar aloft like the eagle so that they seem to float above the world and its problems, far removed and with a vantage point that makes them the ultimate predator. Your nest is among the heights, returning to that image of the safety and security of a home that is unassailable. With these parallel phrases, the image of the one that the prophet, the poet is addressing comes through all the more clearly because the brushstrokes of the language fill it in from different angles. And then finally, what is actually said in the heart? Who will bring me down to the ground? Who will bring me down to the ground? I am unassailable. And yet in parallel, the last line of these two verses, from there, those heights, says God, I will bring you down. This is elegant parallelism. If you've studied poetry, and we recognize that the living in the clefts of the rock, dwelling in the heights in the first half is akin to, but a little different from soaring aloft like the eagle, nest set among the heights, then we could outline this parallelism schematically as a kind of A, B, B, A, C, B prime, B prime, C. Are you following me? The A's are the hearts. A, B, B, A. B's are the elevated life in the first half, clefts of the rock, dwelling in the heights. A, B, B, A. Then we get a new image, C, who will bring me down? Then two more related images of the heights, B prime and B prime, soar aloft, and nest is set among the heights. And then finally, we come back to answer the new theme, which is the question, who will bring me down? And God says, I will bring you down. We end with C. A, B, B, A, C, B prime, B prime, C. Okay, that might be too far into the weeds, but for those who've analyzed poetry that way, it might be interesting. We can see some other simpler parallelism throughout Obadiah. If we look at verse 5, the parallel, if thieves came, would they not take only what they wanted? And if grape gatherers came, would they not leave gleanings? So you get the character who comes, and then the action. Would they not take only what they want? And then would they not leave gleanings? So the parallel there as well. And then in verse 11, again, we see the day that strangers carried off Jacob's wealth and foreigners entered his gates and cast lots for Jerusalem. Strangers carried off, parallel to foreigners entered his gates, and then Jacob's wealth, parallel to Jerusalem. Clear enough, but even interestingly, and this moves us toward Obadiah's unique theme, in the very first part of verse 11, on the day that you stood aside. Then we get the two short parallel lines that we just saw about strangers. And then we get the two short parallel lines about strangers and foreigners. And then the closing line, you too were like one of them. Now, using the principle of parallelism, we can see that you standing aside is that you are like one of them. They who came and plundered Jerusalem, entered the gates, took what they wanted, destroyed Jerusalem. You, by standing aside, were like one of them. Parallelism. It's a powerful, powerful interpretive tool, and one that we've seen many times in the prophets. We've used it to interpret on occasion. But here Obadiah shows us in some clear and simple examples how it can work both simply and rather elegantly. Other style points, the use of repetition. We see this especially in verses 12 to 14, where it's repeated, you should not have gloated, you should not have rejoiced, you should not have boasted, you should not have entered the gate, you should not join in the gloating, you should not have looted, you should not have stood at the crossings to cut off those fleeing, you should not have handed over his survivors. Repetition, this concatenation, this building up of phrase after phrase after phrase, you should not, you should not, you should not, you should. So we see in Obadiah that in terms of themes, in terms of forms, and in terms of style, Obadiah recapitulates for us in a very short span so much of what we've seen in classical prophecy of biblical Israel. Because it's only 21 verses long, this might be a book to actually pay more attention to. Hardly anybody ever pays attention to Obadiah. But honestly, you can practically memorize the whole book and have at your fingertips then, or at your neural tips maybe, you can have this powerful set of examples of a model of classical biblical prophecy. What's a little bit different about Obadiah? Well, there's a new theme that's introduced here, one that's maybe been hinted at, maybe a little bit referenced, but here, what is the central accusation against Edom for which the cup of God's wrath is poured out? It is, and we see it in verses 10 to 14, you stood aside. When those who attacked Jerusalem, the Babylonians who came to finally attack and destroy Jerusalem, and they burned its temple, and they drove all the people out of the city, laid waste to the city, you stood aside. You, Edom, who are Esau, brother to Jacob. And toward the end of their story in Genesis, we see that they reconcile with one another, despite all the problems with them growing up with the pot of porridge for which Esau sold his birthright, and the deception that Jacob undertook with his mother in order to gain that birthright. With all of the anxiety of their returning to meet one another at the crossing of the Jabbok, they do finally reconcile before they agree that one will live here and the other will live there. It's probably best that way. And yet, when trouble comes, the perspective of the prophet is that the brother Esau still is expected to display loyalty, familial closeness, the capacity for Jacob, Israel, to depend on the brother for protection and support. And here it is the sin of inaction, the sin of the bystander, that Obadiah adds to the catalog of potential sins for which God becomes irate at God's people or at any people. The theme is inaction. It's Obadiah's new contribution, as it were. in the midst of showing us in so many other ways what we have seen in the prophets today. Well, let's turn then to our other two prophets for this session, Haggai and the first part of Zechariah, Zechariah 1 through 8. First thing to recognize about Haggai and Zechariah 1 through 8, or what is sometimes called the first book of Zechariah, even though our Bibles don't divide Zechariah into a first and second book. But Zechariah divides itself in many ways, because at the beginning of chapter 9, there's a whole new heading. It says, an oracle. And the times and the figures and the dates and the characters from chapters 9 through 14 of Zechariah are in a totally different time frame and era from what we have in Zechariah 1 through 8, which actually has time markers, dates of oracles and visions, which correlate with those in the book of Haggai, which immediately precedes it in the canon. And so it is customary to think of Haggai and Zechariah 1 through 8, or Haggai and 1st Zechariah, if you will, as a unified text, even though they're divided across two books in our Bible. What helps us to recognize that unified text? First of all, it is the 8 time stamps, if you will, dates that are given in the two books for what is for the material that's given. There are 5 of those in the book of Haggai, and there are 3 more in the book of Zechariah. And by and large, they develop chronologically from beginning to end, but actually they overlap exactly where the books divide. So the first date in Zechariah is a little bit before the last date in Haggai. And so it's almost like they overlap and to link together the two books by the dates. Haggai covering the dates just from August to December of the year 520 BCE, a mere 4 months. And then Zechariah 1 through 8, starting in October of 520 BCE, the middle of Haggai's activity, and extending then for about 2 years through November of 518 BCE. So the dating scheme holds them together. There's also a close thematic continuity between them. This is about the rebuilding of the temple and the leadership of the community after the exile has ended. And we'll look in a moment at a timeline that helps us to understand where we are in Israel's history. Carol and Eric Myers, who have written one commentary on Haggai and Zechariah 1 through 8, describe this literature, these two books, as the ideological basis for the Second Commonwealth, that is, for the renewed kingdom of Judah. And so the focus thematically in both of these is building the temple, rebuilding the temple, and establishing the leadership for this post-exilic period. And then there are also internal and external biblical references to the pair, Haggai and Zechariah. Within Zechariah itself, near the end of this section, Zechariah 8, verse 9, it says, "You have recently been hearing these words from the prophets who were present at the laying of the foundation stone of the temple." And the prophets there would be indeed Haggai and Zechariah. It would be unusual for a prophet otherwise to refer to both their own prophecy and another's prophecy as though this is one unit. But Zechariah does that and says, "You have been hearing from these prophets who have been present." We believe referring to Zechariah's own prophecy and Haggai's prophecy and yoking them together. The book of Ezra yokes them by name in 2 different places in telling the history of this time, Ezra's history of this time. It's not definitive or neutral in any sense, but it is a history of this time. And the way Ezra tells it, in chapter 5, verse 1, there's a reference to the prophets Haggai and Zechariah, together as a pair. And then again in chapter 6, verse 14, a reference to the prophets Haggai and Zechariah named together as a pair. So all of these things persuade us that Haggai and Zechariah 1 through 8 belong together as a unit. To go a little bit further into the timeline and background, we in recent weeks have been talking about Jeremiah and Ezekiel, and we've been at the beginning of the 6th century BCE. Of course, in BCE, the beginning is the high numbers. So 598, 597, the first deportation from Jerusalem to Babylon that included the priest Ezekiel. 587, 586, where we start on this timeline, the final fall of Jerusalem to Nebuchadnezzar, to the Babylonians, the burning and destruction of the temple, as you can see in the illustration there. And then the Babylonian exile extending just about exactly 50 years down to the Edict of Cyrus in 538 BCE, and the first return of exiled Judeans to Jerusalem and to Judah. That happened in 538. When we pick up the story in Haggai and Zechariah, it is now 18 years later, it's 520, and Darius, who was the successor, the significant successor to Cyrus, there was one brief successor who didn't hang around for long, but Darius, in his second year of kingship, sends back another group from Babylon to Jerusalem with renewed orders to rebuild the temple. And they come under a figure named Zerubbabel. But Zerubbabel comes as the governor of Judah, and he is almost always paired with Joshua, the son of Jehozadak, as the high priest. And the image you see at the bottom of the screen here, which has also been part of the logo in the upper right for this whole session, is a 16th century woodcut of Zerubbabel. I believe that the woodcut is actually a copy of a medallion dating to antiquity, but I haven't dug far enough into it to be able to confirm that for sure. But in any event, this would be an image of Zerubbabel, as you can see in the 16th century spelling there, if you can look closely. The governor of Judah, appointed by Darius as a Persian functionary, but himself having Davidic heritage. He was a descendant of David. He was the grandson of King Jehoiakim, the last king of the Davidic line, who was exiled from Jerusalem in 598, 597. While he comes under Persian sponsorship, he is a legitimate descendant of David and is undoubtedly chosen for this role precisely because of that, because it gives him credibility and authenticity with the Judeans. So this is now 520, and Zerubbabel and Joshua are sent back to Jerusalem from Babylon in order to take up the reconstruction of the temple, which may have started somewhere after 538, but clearly had not advanced very far. The prophecy of these two prophets, Haggai and Zechariah, responsible for chapters 1 through 8, really extends only over about 2 1/4, 2 1/3 years, from 520 to 518. And then it would be another 3 years or so before the Second Temple is dedicated in 515 BCE. So that's the time frame that we're working in. We're 50 years past where we were dealing with Ezekiel, and a little bit more than that past where we were dealing with Jeremiah, or at least that much. And so what do these two have to say in this very new setting? Because what I'm suggesting is that in this new setting, they take up the prophetic form, but they also transform it. They take it into some, what we could call mutations. If Obadiah was a model then here we see some mutations on that model. And I would suggest that there are three in particular. One is that these prophets support and encourage a political order set in place by a foreign power in Judah. That is a whole new ballgame. There's no question that Jeremiah counseled the leadership of his day to recognize that Babylon was God's instrument and that Judah would succumb to Babylon for a time as a discipline or a punishment from God. But there was no idea that Babylon somehow was a legitimate political power under which Judah should attempt to set up an ongoing life. And that's what we have here in Haggai and Zechariah. Moreover, the leadership model for the community, which has always been a king with a prophet at the side and with priests in the temple, but clearly with the Davidic king as the leading figure of a king, priest, prophet triumvirate kind of thing. That is now going to be transformed because of the circumstances of Persian rule and Zerubbabel's position as a Persian officer. And then finally, there is, particularly in Zechariah, the extensive use of vision. And we started to see some visions in Ezekiel, but in terms of the scope of the book, they were significant and dramatic, but there was lots of material in Ezekiel that was not visionary. In Zechariah 1 through 8, we'll see that a good solid 3/4 of this prophet's book of chapters 1 through 8 is occupied with visions. So 3 kinds of mutations, but let's start with Haggai and to see how some of this looks. Haggai, again, a brief book, just 2 chapters, only seems to have been active for 4 months in late 520 BCE. But in those 4 months was absolutely transformational as Haggai carried the day in persuading Zerubbabel and the other leaders of the community in Judah that they should go ahead with rebuilding the temple. Is Haggai who really steps into the center of the situation and says in 5 oracles, each one dated with some varying but interlocking themes. Yes, you should build the temple. And what are those themes? Well, in the first oracle in chapter 1, verses 1 through 12, by the way, on this slide, the bold underlined verse numbers, 1:1, 1:15, and then 2:1, 2:10, and 2:20. Those are the verses in which you will find the dates of Haggai's oracles or reports, when the word comes to Haggai from the Lord. In the first one, chapter 1, 1 through 12, Haggai, the word of the Lord comes by Haggai to Zerubbabel and Joshua. And in essence, it says, how you been doing there since you haven't been building my temple? And the implicit answer is life has not been very good. In fact, it becomes explicit in the description. And so the Lord says, so build and see what will happen. Without a temple, without attending to the place for me to live in your midst, you have not been doing so well. So build and see what will happen. Zerubbabel and Joshua and the people respond, we will do that, in verses 13 and 14. And then in verse 15, God says to the people, all the people, I am with you. God says, go build. They concur. God says, I am with you. What more assurance could you want that you should go ahead with this plan? Then in chapter 2, there seems to have been a concern that we can't quite build the temple we'd really like to build. We know what Solomon's temple looked like. It was magnificent. We don't have what it takes to build that. And so the word now comes to Zerubbabel and Joshua. Go on, build. I will bring the splendor to the house. This is in this amazing image of I will shake the nations. I'll shake the nations like you shake an olive tree and the olives fall off it, or I'll shake the nations, and the wealth of the nations will roll to Jerusalem, and that will bring the splendor of the temple. In chapter 2, verses 10 to 19, the word comes from Haggai, and he speaks to the priests and says, and in essence, this says, you're concerned that you have not had holiness. You have not been able to maintain holiness because of the situation in which you find yourself. But I promise you from now on, it will be holy. This house, this temple that you're building will be holy, and you as priests will be holy. And then finally, at the end of the chapter, at the end of the book, chapter 2, verses 20 to 23, again, the word comes by Haggai to Zerubbabel. And he says, God says, I will reign. Again, I will shake the nations. I am in control. I will shake the nations. But you, I will make like a signet ring. So if you want to know whether a king is really legitimate and has the power that the king claims, what you do is you look for the signet ring. You look for the ring on the finger that is the ring of the dynasty that says the one who wears this really is the power. Kings had those. Actually, it comes into church life in the fact that the Pope wears a ring, which signifies that he is in fact the first among equals among all the bishops of the world. And he is the Pope. And so God says, I will reign, but you, Zerubbabel, you will be my signet ring. You will be the symbol of my reign in this place. And with that, Haggai's book ends. You haven't been doing so well? Build the house, you'll see. I am with you. Go on, it doesn't have to be glorious. I will bring the splendor, says God. And priests, don't worry. It will be holy from now on. Zerubbabel, I will reign, and you will be my signet. 5 oracles, 5 quick messages of encouragement, of reassurance, of promise. And it was enough to move Zerubbabel and Joshua and all the people to go ahead and build that second temple. As we turn to Zechariah chapters 1 through 8, I've already mentioned that the first date in Zechariah is a little before the last one in Haggai. So Haggai's last word to Zerubbabel about the signet ring is December of 520. But already in October of 520, Zechariah was offering his first word. And these 8 chapters in Zechariah offer us a word, 8 visions, and then a reprise to Haggai. Remember, we consider them as one body of work. So what's the word with which Zechariah opens? Well, it's right in the first chapter, chapter 1, verses 1 through 6. And the word is quite simply, don't be like your ancestors, to whom the former prophets proclaimed, return from your evil ways and your evil doings. But they did not hear or heed, says the Lord. That's the superscription. That sets the tone for all of what Zechariah will have to say in chapters 1 through 8. Don't be like your ancestors who didn't heed or pay attention. In other words, listen up. And it's a listen up in no small measure because things are about to change. So we move into the 8 visions of Zechariah. It's really not so hard to see a structure within them and a pattern within them. Again, I rely on Carol and Eric Myers and their analysis to show you this, but it's a nested literary structure in which 8 units really, I show it as 7 on the slide, but the middle one on the slide is actually 2 visions, a prophetic vision and then Zechariah's next vision. So they're nested so that the first and the 7th, the 2nd and the 6th, the 3rd and the 5th parallel each other. They're related thematically to each other. They're related in some ways by their imagery to each other. And so when you look at them this way, you realize that it's the one in the middle. Here, chapter 3, verse 1 to 4:14, Joshua and the temple, those are the 2 visions. It's that one in the middle, which is really the focus of all of this. Because you go from a universal, broad, cosmic, universal framework down to an international situation, down to looking at the nation of Judah itself, and then finally focused on the temple and its leadership. And then from there, you build out again to the nation, and from there to the international setting, and from there again to the universe. So it's like concentric circles where you go in and come back out. It's like a bracket where you start, as on the slide, with levels of indentation that that parallel each other above and below on both sides of this central image of Joshua and the temple, which we will look at. I'll leave it to you if you want to explore all of this in a little more detail in terms of the structure of the 8 images. It's available in the PDF of the PowerPoint slides that you're looking at. But just to see how they function together in these concentric circles, universal, international, national, Joshua and the temple, high priest and temple, and then back out national, international, universe. So let's begin with the first of the visions. We'll look at 3 texts here that I suggested you might look at in advance. And immediately following the word that we've already heard, the epigram of don't be like your ancestors, we come to this first vision, chapter 1, verses 7 to 17. The divine horse patrol, the vision of the 4 horses. Who are these? What are they? Who are the figures on the horses? And the response is when they're sent out to explore throughout all the world, all the universe, in effect, what's the situation out there? And they come back and they report, well, the whole earth remains at peace. Wow, that's pretty astonishing. It should be a very positive thing. And actually, in the Persian Empire around this time, things were pretty quiet. This was a new global power that had arisen, and it was pretty effectively keeping things quiet all around. And yet, God says, I am angry with the nations who are at ease. Why? Because I was only a little angry, but they made the disaster worse. What's this about? God has said, and we saw it in both Jeremiah and Ezekiel, God has said, I was angry with Judah, Israel and Judah. They were not obedient. They were not faithful. And so in my anger, I brought Assyria and Babylonia against them in order to punish them, in order to discipline them, in order to make them wake up. And they didn't. And so the natural consequence was they went off into exile. But the intent was that they should get better. The intent was that they should come to faithfulness. But the nations I used as my instrument overstepped their bounds. I was only a little angry. They made the disaster worse. And so God says, I do have compassion for Jerusalem and for Judah. My cities shall again overflow with prosperity. The Lord will again comfort Zion and choose Jerusalem. This is the great opening promise of Zechariah, that God is about to do something that will restore Zion, Jerusalem, the temple, to what God had intended from the very beginning, even through the exile, even through the destruction of the city. God still holds the desire to comfort Zion, choose Jerusalem. And that means that God will again live there, and that means that there must be a temple. That was the opening universal vision. Everything's at peace, and God says, yeah, but they shouldn't sit so easy because they overstepped their bounds, and I will come and restore justice to Zion and Jerusalem. Then we move through an international scene of the four smiths and the four horses. We move through the national vision of the man with the measuring rod who measures out how the new land of Judah in its autonomy will be laid out in the world. And then we come to the point to these central visions of Joshua and the temple. And this is actually in two parts, the Joshua vision in chapter 3, and then the lampstand and olive tree vision in chapter 4. So looking at the first one, Joshua the priest, there's a vision of Joshua the high priest who stands before God and actually Satan. Satan understood not as the devil, so to speak, in Dante's imagery, for example, but Satan as a member of the heavenly court who stands and accuses those who may have offended God. But in this case, God recognizes that Joshua, despite the fact that he's in filthy rags, this is the unholiness of the priests that Haggai was talking about. Even though he comes in dirty rags, nevertheless he gets reclothed in festal attire and receives the promise from God, you will rule my house and have charge of my courts. This is investiture. This is being installed into office as the high priest in the new temple that's being built. And Joshua is given the privilege of being that high priest by God over the objections, whatever objections any Satan, any objector might try to bring. God gives Joshua the pure festal attire of the high priest and gives Joshua rule over God's house and charge of God's courts. Then to the end of this passage, of this vision, the question is, well, what's the lampstand and the olive trees? And these represent the temple of God, the lampstand, where there was, in fact, the lampstand with the 7 branches, the menorah, and the 2 anointed ones of the Lord. The 2 anointed ones. Now, anointed comes into English from the Hebrew and through Greek and through the Romance languages. It ultimately ends up in English as the word Messiah. The temple and the 2 Messiahs, the 2 anointed. Well, let's start with one of them, the one who is called the branch. The branch. What is a branch? Well, you can't be in the realm of Hebrew prophecy and not recognize the branch as a figure for the Messiah from the house of David, the royal Messiah who rules in the heritage and the character of King David. We see it in Psalms 132:17. I will cause a horn to sprout up for David. There it's a horn, but the verb to sprout comes from the same basic verbal root as this word to be a branch. In Isaiah, on that day, the branch of the Lord shall be bright and glorious. Again, in the day of the Lord imagery. Isaiah 11, a shoot shall come out from Jesse's stump, and a branch shall come out of his roots. Jeremiah, the days are surely coming when I will raise up for David a righteous branch. In Jeremiah 33, verse 15, in those days and at that time I will cause a righteous branch to spring up for David. So there is a full expectation here that there will be a royal Messiah. And yet, Zerubbabel is not named. Haggai actually had identified Zerubbabel as God's chosen to lead the people. But here in Zechariah, it's hedged a little bit. Whether Zerubbabel is the Davidic Messiah or not. It could be dangerous for Zerubbabel to be identified as that, because as a certain later figure would find out, who was identified with the Davidic Messiah, that can be a real threat to the political power that is in place. One can end up being crucified for claims that one is the Messiah, whether one accepts those claims or not. So it's very touchy to try to say that Zerubbabel is this Messiah. And in fact, in chapter 6 later on, where this branch language is used again, the crown that is made for that, there are two crowns made, one of silver, one of gold, one for each Messiah. The one goes on Joshua's head as the high priest, right there in that time, real time. 6th century BCE, Joshua is crowned high priest. The other crown, the gold one, is set in the temple. And it is here in this place, this temple, that a branch will spring up. Zechariah sees it as a future branch, as a future hope for a return of a royal figure who will reestablish autonomy for the Jews in the temple and in the land. And the message that is given to Zerubbabel is not by might, nor by power, but by my spirit, says the Lord. What will govern God's people in this post-exilic period will be not a political figure who exercises might and power over against Persia or any other neighboring political force that would try to subdue it, that has subdued it, but rather by my spirit, says the Lord. There will be a high priest ruling in the temple and guiding the people in their religious duties and representing the kingship of God, if you will, through these two crowns, one of which is carried by Joshua legitimately as the priest, the other of which Zerubbabel does not wear. It's set in the temple to await a future royal political leader. But Zerubbabel is affirmed as the leader of the people with God's Spirit, by God's Spirit. This is a real mutation of prophecy, classical prophecy. To look at a figure who's been set in place by a foreign power and who cannot aspire to or claim the mantle of the great King David, who is told in effect, don't seek that might, don't seek that power. but be the Persian governor over this people, your people, by my Spirit, says God. Grace, grace to it, and thereby lead the people in this new and odd time. As we turn then to the final text in Zechariah that we want to look at, we look at chapter 8, verses 9 to 23. And I see this in some ways, as do the Myers, as a reprise to Haggai. First of all, there's a very clear reference to Haggai that I've already mentioned. You have recently been hearing from the prophets who were present when the foundation stone of this temple was laid. And then the image that before the temple was built, there were no wages. That language is exactly an echo of Haggai chapter 1, where the question is asked, how have you fared since you haven't been building the temple? How's it been going? How's that worked out for you? But there were no wages is a clear verbal echo. Here it says there will be a sowing of peace, just as Haggai had said that from this day on, I will bless you. Here we have the interpretation, the understanding, just as I purposed to bring disaster when your ancestors provoked me, so again, I have purposed to do good to Jerusalem. And we recall from the very beginning of Zechariah, in that opening word that links it back to Haggai, don't be like them. And then finally, in this glorious final statement, many peoples and strong nations shall come to seek the Lord, saying, let us go with you, for we have heard that God is with you. And we remember, I will shake the heavens and earth and take you, O Zerubbabel, and make you like a signet ring. This is the great promise. This is the great hope. This is the great word of God that these two prophets, Haggai and Zechariah, offer to Israel. The temple that they can build may not be glorious. The political autonomy that they know is promised may not yet have arrived, but it gets reaffirmed. The complete fulfillment of their hopes and dreams as they have imagined them, their vision of the future, may not be coming to pass. But Haggai and Zechariah nevertheless say, persevere, do what you can. God has visions to show you of what will yet be. And in those visions, we start with this temple and a priestly leadership here and now. It is the focus of God's concern, of God's grace, of God's gifts to you now. And there is set within that temple another crown representing another hope that will yet come to fruition, just as this one is coming to fruition. Even under the sway of a foreign nation, God's people can trust the Lord to sustain and support them, both in the present day with whatever is possible, and with promise and hope for a new day of God's reign. So, Obadiah offers a concise model of classical biblical Hebrew prophecy. Haggai and Zechariah 1 through 8 offer the power of transformation of that model, both pragmatic and visionary. Still with expectations. Note that in chapter 8 of Zechariah, there is a scroll that goes out and judges the people household by household. Righteousness and justice and right living are still expected. in this new commonwealth that God is establishing. Chapter 8, verses 16 and 17, this is how you shall act. Speak truth. You will render justice that is true and makes for peace. You will not devise evil in your hearts against one another. You will swear no false oath. This is not a carte blanche to live any way you want. God will take care of whatever. This is God setting up a new opportunity for the people of God to live as the people of God, witnessing to God's justice, righteousness, faithfulness through their own lives, echoing and reflecting those realities of their God. These people, these characteristics will be the witness to the world that God is with us. And that will ultimately draw in people from nations of every kind. Thank you for joining me for this session of Heart.Soul.Mind in our series on the prophets. We'll next turn to two more of the prophets of this post-exilic period, later in this period by decades, Malachi and the remainder of Zechariah, chapters 9 through 14. I look forward to being with you for that session. Thank you for joining us for this one. God bless.